Hi, I'm Jess.
And I'm Erin.
We're from Paper Pieces. Today we're here to show you the basics of English paper piecing with our free sample packs. English paper piecing has been around since the 1700s and it's popular today because of the portability and the accuracy. Today we're going to show you how to make one of our free sample packs. Erin, what's in our sample pack?
Our sample pack has a full instruction for how to make a hexagon flower. It comes with 7 fabrics and 7 paper pieces, 3/4 inch hexagons, which are the perfect size for your group or guild to learn how to English paper piece. And these are available free on our website for anybody who would like to try this.
Awesome. So you're going to show us how to glue baste and how to whip stitch the hexagons?
Yes.
All right.
Basting is one of my favorite ways for basting just because it's quick and sometimes I just don't have much time. So for the sample pack, you will need to have a thread, needle, and scissors. For the glue basting portion, you'll need some glue. We prefer the Sew-Line glue pens. It's just a nice fine edge for glue basting. You can use other types of glue, but this is just a nice one to use. So to glue baste, I start by putting just a little dot of glue in the center of my hexagon. That allows it to stick to the fabric without shifting. You can skip this step, but I like to do it just to hold it in place. I'm going to swipe along one edge. You do want to be a little bit away from that edge, and when you press your fabric back, you don't want to pull it tight so that there is a little bit of give between the fabric and the paper. I'm just going to continue to work around the hexagon. I always work in the same direction so that if I have any tails, you don't have tails with hexagons, but if you have any tails, then they would wag into each other. I'm going to continue to work around, and I'm not pulling tight. I'm just swiping and pressing, and hold it just for a second so it gives that glue a second to dry.
And this is a water-soluble glue, so it's not permanent, right?
Right. When you're done, you can just pop these papers right back out. You can reuse them. The glue washes out of your fabric where it's touching your fabric.
That's important.
Wash. One thing with the glue is that sometimes your corners don't stick down. That's okay. If you have to work backwards, this pen just sticks right in there. You can just lift it up where it's not sticking and just swipe a little glue in there and pop it back down.
That went quickly.
It was quick. So once you have all your pieces basted, I'm going to show you how to do the whip stitch. For the whip stitch, it's just the simplest stitch for piecing your shapes together. You're going to take your thread and make a knot at the end. I just use a basic knot.
And what type of thread are you using?
I'm using the Quilter's Select bobbins. I prefer these. They're an 80 weight thread. They're very fine thread, so it hides my stitches. It also comes in a rainbow of colors, so I can almost always find one that matches my fabrics.
That bobbin ring is perfect. You can put that right in your sewing bag and take it anywhere with you and have all the colors.
Yep, all the colors. They also have it in a neutral palette, so if you don't prefer bright colors, there's neutrals as well. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to bury my knot in my seam allowance by going underneath my seam allowance. Just hides right under there. And I start away from my corner. That's just personal preference. I like to do one stitch away from my corner, and then I work to my corner. And at my corner, I do a knot to hold that corner nice and tight. And with the whip stitch, you're just stitching through one side. So it's the simplest stitch. You're just same step.
And here you're only catching the fabric. You don't want to pierce your papers.
Right, so you don't want to go through your papers. You can feel the difference. There's not much give there. And you can feel where the fabric meets. And that's where it's important not to pull your fabric too tight against the paper, because otherwise it's hard to get your needle in there.
So a looser baste gives your fabric a little bit more flexibility while you're stitching it together.
When I get to my corner again here, I'm going to do an extra stitch and a simple knot. going to do another stitch backwards, and then I just run my needle through and trim my thread. And there you have two pieces together. And you can't see the stitches. You want to make sure that you don't have too much give between, you don't want to see light between your pieces when you hold them up.
And so that's usually about 10 to 15 stitches per an inch, and that will secure your pieces together without them coming apart when you're quilting.
And the quilting takes a lot of that tension off of that seam, so really, as long as you have enough to hold it together, you're okay. You don't need to do a satin stitch along that edge to hold your shapes together. The quilting holds. Okay. So I like to work in rows when I'm piecing. It just makes it easier for me to make my hexagon flower. When I join them, it makes it more efficient to do an entire seam at a time than to have just keep starting and stopping all the time.
What type of needle are you using?
I like the John James number 9s. The 10s I hold too tight and I snap them in my hand. The 7s are too clunky for me.
Okay.
We sell all of those on our website. A lot of it is personal preference, just whatever you like to use.
The general rule with our needles is that the higher the number, the longer and thinner the needle. So the number 7s are a little shorter and a little thicker, and the number 9s are just in between there.
I like the 7s for if I thread baste because it just gives me a little bit more punch to get through the paper. So I'm going to start to add my row. I'm going to put the right sides together. I'm going to use a wonder clip to hold my corner in place just to get me started. I'm going to make my knot again.
Those Clover Wonder Clips are like having a third hand.
They are. Oops. I'm going to bury my knot in the seam allowance again. And work back to my corner. And then back towards my corner again.
I notice you're not wearing a thimble. I don't know how you can sew with no thimble on your finger.
I use fabric band-aids sometimes
Okay.
when the needle gets to be too much for my hand and starts to poke me, but I just can't wear a thimble. I've tried all of the thimbles out there and I can't.
That's one of the great things about English paper piecing is that there's so many different ways and methods and techniques, but everyone can find a way to make it work best for them because you want to make it fun because you're typically working on these projects for a little bit of time.
There are no rules. So when I get to my corner, I'm going to fold my fabric back out the way that I want it to go, and then I'm just going to fold again. And if you find that your paper is pushing where this Y seam meets, you can just give it a little bit of a bend. It doesn't hurt your paper, so you can unfold it and press that back flat again. I do a knot at my corner again to hold that corner nice and tight. I like my corners crisp and perfect.
That's easy to do with paper piecing. The pre-cut papers give it the perfect shape almost every time.
A knot again at the corner. Open it back up and turn again. I like to have enough thread to do a length at a time. If you use too much thread, then you end up getting knots. If you use too little, then you're constantly having to rethread your needle. I like to use about 12 inches. That's enough to do a good bit of sewing without having to stop. And it doesn't get tangled.
It also helps to have some preloaded needles before you sit down to sew. If you thread 4 or 5 needles before you start, you'll be going for quite a while.
We're in the final stretch right there. I hate when I unthread my needle.
So your thread just fell out of the eye of your needle?
Happens to me all the time.
So at this point, since you just tied a knot, you could technically just start with a new piece of thread so that you have enough to finish that seam.
I could. I'm determined to finish with this piece though.
So I actually learned a trick from Sarah Felke. If you lick your needle, the eye of your needle, instead of your thread, it will suck your thread through the eye.
Oh, really?
Yep. It's pretty interesting.
Did not know that. I will have to try that the next time I drop my thread on my needle. So this whip stitch is so simple. I've even taught my daughter to do it, and she just turned 7.
That's so fun that you get to start that tradition with someone so young, and you guys can make quilts together.
Yeah, we're starting with a pot holder.
That's a good place to start.
We've made 2 hexagon flowers so far,
Okay.
so our patience is not there yet. But you can also start and stop so easily that we can work as long as we want to, and we can just put it down and come right back to it when we have time.
The other great aspect of English paper piecing is that it's portable. You can take it anywhere, whether it's just the couch to watch TV or the train or the doctor's office. You can do it anywhere.
Long car rides.
As long as you're not driving.
Okay, so I got to my edge, I stopped, and I came back, and I'm just going to finish by running my needle through the fabric one last time. And trim. And there you have it, the full flower.
It's perfect. So what will you do with that flower now?
I can applique it to a background and use it as an accent for something, or I could continue on and make a pot holder or a quilt.
And just keep going.
Keep going. And Jess is going to show us how to thread baste now.
Yes, I like to thread baste. I've tried both ways, and this is the one that works best for me. I find that it's really meditative. I can sit and relax on the couch in the evenings and baste some hexies whenever I have a spare moment. So I will show you how I do that. So this is our Clover needle threader, and what you do is you take your needle and you want to put the eye of your needle down in this little hole, and it even says the needle slot. So you set that in there, and then you're going to take your piece of thread, and like Erin said, about 12 to 18 inches works best when you're English paper piecing. And you're just going to push the button, and when you pull your needle out, it will be threaded. So you can pull your tail back through and start sewing. So before you thread baste, you want to be sure to tie a knot in the end of your fabric. And I have a little trick for tying knots. I set the thread on my finger and I wrap it around once, and then I use my thumb to just roll it off my finger. And when I slide the thread down, it makes the perfect knot. And this is a temporary thread, so it doesn't have to be perfect if the knot looks a little sloppy. So what I'm gonna do is put my paper on my fabric, and I have about a quarter, the smallest portion is about 1/4 of an inch for the seam allowance. So I just fold each corner over, and I'm just gonna sew right through the paper. The paper weight and quality that we use for our pieces is thin enough to sew through, but thick enough for durability and reuse.
How many times can you reuse the papers?
I personally use mine 3 or 4 times before I get fresh ones, and that stands for glue basting or thread basting.
Even with the holes?
Yes, as long as the edges and the points of your papers are intact, you can keep on using them. So I'm just gonna fold each corner over, and the amount of basting stitches you take really depends on how large or small your piece is. I definitely try to have a stitch at each corner. And on larger pieces, I probably put a basting stitch every 1 to 1.5 inches.
What kind of thread are you using?
I am a fan of Aurifil 60 weight. I'm a little more rough with my thread, so I have tried 80 weight and I tend to break it quite often. So I recommend just trying out everything until you find something that works best for you. Okay, so now that I have that piece basted, I am going to snip my thread, and then I'm actually gonna show you how to do the flat back stitch to attach 2 pieces together. So what you do for the flat back stitch is you want to use a matching thread. I'm going to reuse my needle threader. So I have the eye of my needle down in the slot, and I'm gonna place my thread in the thread slot and push the button.
So easy.
It's a lifesaver. Okay. So again, I'm gonna knot the end of my fabric, and just like Erin said, I've got about 12 inches of fabric here. Instead of taking my 2 pieces and putting the right sides together, I'm actually gonna leave them open, and I'm going to be working from the back side. So to start, I will also bury my knot by putting my needle up under the seam allowance and coming out at the corner and catching the corner of the next piece. Here I'm gonna tie a knot as well. Whoops, okay. Okay, so here I'm gonna tie a knot in the corner. And I'm just going to do the flat back stitch. So that is where you take your needle through both pieces, but you wanna make sure that your needle and thread stay on the wrong side of your pieces. That way your stitching won't show from the front. So I'll just go back and forth and catch each piece. And it's the same rule of thumb with stitches per an inch. 10 to 15 stitches per an inch is plenty, because once it's quilted, the pressure comes off your hand sewn seams. And that's whether you hand quilt or machine quilt. So I'm just gonna work my way all the way down, but I'm running it into my hand, so I'm just gonna flip it around.
Do you ever find that your pieces shift as you're trying to sew them this way?
If I'm using larger pieces, I do find that. So one way of doing the flat back stitch is on your right sides. Before you start sewing, you can put a piece of tape or use the Sew Tight magnets to put the pieces together. But since these 3/4 inch hexagons are pretty small, it is not that necessary. So I've just got room for about 1 more stitch and a knot. And my corners are lining up, so I'm happy with that. And I'll just loop that thread to get a knot. It's always good luck to take an extra back stitch. So there we go. We have got the flat back stitch, and the stitch there is basically invisible.
Very nice.
Okay. My basting's coming undone and it looks really sloppy. Okay, so in the same manner as Erin finished her hexagon flower, I would do the same. I like to sew mine in rows. There's no particular order that you have to sew your flowers together. It's whatever works best for you. I like to go around the flower center, and you can keep using the flat back stitch in that manner as well. So that's the basics of English paper piecing. If you or your group want to try, you can reach out to paperpieces.com for a free sample.
Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Happy stitching!
Thanks for watching.